particular topic that you're dying to learn more about, please fill out this form and send it to us, and we'll follow up on it.
Eduardo, sorry, she's an apology. She's an apology for today's call.
Eduardo? Yeah. Hi, this is Heidi. Yeah, I've already put it into the chat. So please, everyone, I know a few of you already have some thoughts about additional budget requests, but you have just a couple of weeks to get that to your RALO before they send it to the ALAC Finance and Budget Subcommittee. Thank you.
Yeah, there's one more thing that I need to mention. I'm calling out Jonathan and David Mackey. They volunteered to, we're going to be assessing our web presence, the navigation, the look and feel. So the committee will be assembling with yourself, Eduardo, fairly soon. So if anybody, I think we've closed that committee. So we should be organizing our first Zoom call fairly soon. So I'm not sure, Eduardo, are you around next week? Okay. I'll send out a doodle to all four of us. So the idea being is we want to look at the navigation. We want to see if we're getting the message out. It's one of our primary tools to talk about NARALO. So that'll be a topic, and first meeting is going to be the scope of our project, and then move forward with recommendations. So that we'll report on that in possibly January, latest in February. Great, thanks everybody. It was interesting. I mentioned to Eduardo, and this is the thing about Eduardo, he's very clever. I said, you know what? I think we should learn a little bit about transfer policy. He says, you're right. He says, we need to understand the relevance of transfer policy to the end users. I said, you're right. And he says, you will moderate the session. And so I said, okay, I'll do it. And now I have to let everybody know this is something I'm no expert at all. I'm happy to moderate this. And I think we brought in a great panel. And in fact, I've asked Michael to join us as well, and after the introductions. And then I'm going to ask Michael to sort of give some historical context, because I can't do that. I went through endlessly the Icann website. It's sort of convoluted, but maybe because Michael was on the board years ago, maybe he can sort of level set the historical context. So Sarah, Daniel, and James, you're off the hook on the first thing. But I wanted to do a quick round the table so you guys know who everybody is. If I may, starting with Sarah, maybe you can just open up your mic and and say a little bit about yourself.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sarah Wyld. I work with TUCAS. I've been here for just over 4 years. And before this, I was working at another registrar for about 10 years. So I've been in the industry for some time now. My title is Policy and Privacy Manager. So I spend half of my time enjoying Icann policy development work and the other half doing internal data governance within the TUCAS organization. And in terms of the transfer policy, my first sort of real memory of the new transfer policy is from the 2013 RAA, when that new policy, I think, came into place at the same time or together connected. So we had to implement that at my previous workplace. So I got the really operational implementation fun part of it as a user. And then now I have the pleasure of being a member of the Transfer Policy Development Working Group, helping to represent registrars. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. And I guess you missed Graham, that he moved on to the DNS Abuse Institute.
I do. And of course, I'm still in contact with Graham. I was talking with him only just a few minutes ago, but I do miss getting to work with him on a day-to-day basis. Yes.
Perfect. Okay, I'm going to stay, because what I'm looking on the screen, I'm just going to go across the top. James, would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Glenn. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. I am part of the Transfer Review PDP. I'm representing registries in that context, one of our two designated delegates there. I have a long history with Icann, been around since pretty much its inception. My role started with the Security and Stability Advisory Committee. I grew into the registry stakeholder group when I joined Affilius back in 2009, and now I'm actually part of Donuts, since Donuts acquired Affilius just about a year ago. In fact, we're like 10 days shy of having been acquired a year ago. So just been around and involved in things a long time. I consider myself a security technologist. I have been all of my career, which spans more than 3 decades. Just a lot of activity in standards development, policy development has been the last 10 or 15 years of my life. I started out my career doing protocol development and security technology development and deployment and that kind of thing, and just migrated up to being a public face of activities that are going on. So that's where I am today, and a lot of activity. Oh, I should probably mention, just for completeness, one of the hats that I do wear today is I was appointed as SX, as the Security and Stability Advisory Committee, as their liaison to the Icann board, a seat which I took on October 28th of this year at the AGM. But I'm here representing, wearing my Donuts hat and wearing, representing registries in general, just to be clear for the transcript. So thanks.
Perfect. Thanks again, James. Just carrying on. Michael, how do you pronounce your last name properly? I may have messed it up.
Pelage.
Pelage? Okay.
Pelage, yep.
Okay, perfect. Michael, tell us about yourself.
Well, I would say most people have probably been around, have known me, who's been around Icann and probably have come across me. My first exposure to the domain name space was 1994. And one of the first people I actually met was actually a fellow attorney, John Berryhill. We were both attorneys in Philadelphia. So as John and I like to joke, we were probably doing domain name disputes when they were still free, before Network Solutions even started charging for it. As a result of that initial interest, I was involved. We were one of the first 37, I believe 35 or 37 Icann accredited registrars. Served as the initial chair of the registrar constituency, served a 3-year term on the Icann board. There's probably not any position I have not yet held except for the GNSO Council, although I have no interest in ticking that box before I head out the pasture. But I generally work, I would say, predominantly with registries over the last, say, 15 to 20 years, but do work with registrars as well as business, IPC, pretty much everyone. So
great, thank you. I'll circle back to you in 1 minute, but let me turn over to our colleague, Daniel. Please go ahead and say a little bit about yourself and how you're involved with the committee.
Yeah, thank you very much, Glenn and the team here. I'm happy to be invited for this NARALO meeting, especially in the Transfer Policy Review Working Group, also as a representative at large. Just a brief history about my involvement with Icann and the technical community. It dates way back from 10 years plus, especially when I started my engagement with the AFRINIC, that is the Africa Network Information Center, as a fellow. And then later on, when I started diving deep into engagement with Icann, I happened to be a member of the Registration Data Services Working Group. By the time it was being chaired by Chuck Gomez, who later left on to take on other respective tasks. But when it comes specifically to the domain industry, I have been involved in the domain industry for over 8 years of experience, and I've been working with various registrars trying to make sure that domain disputes are solved. And my latest role is trying to deploy the Internet Africa, a platform to be able to promote the modern internet standards. And if you look at modern internet standards, DNSSEC comes in strongly. And if you look at the domain industry, it also comes in, because if you were to check the validity of the domain, whether it is following these standards, a lot of things happen. And with reference to the end user experiences, there are quite a number of challenges that come in. And some of these challenges are being discussed in the TPR. Just to mention, most of the end users happen to work with resellers, and they seem not to know the underlying issues or policies that govern their respective ownership of the domain. So they don't know whether they're registrant or not. So probably we shall be diving deep into this discussion as we get on. Let me get back to Glenn.
Yeah, thank you. You're biting to jump on the horse and ride. So just hold that thought. It's excellent stuff. I've been amiss to acknowledge a few people, and I'd like to acknowledge, first of all, I don't know what time it is, Maureen, and where you are. I'm not sure if you're in New Zealand right now or Cook Islands, but it must be in the middle of the night. Thank you so much. Maureen Hilliard is the chair for At Large. Thank you so much for joining us today. But also, I want to do a shout out to Nalia and Joe of the North American Icann group. So they've also joined us in our own special ALAC member, which is Marita and Jonathan. So thank you all for coming. I want to start off with some history. And as I said earlier on, I thought myself, I said, let me find some history here. And it was really, the website that Icann had was a little bit convoluted. And I said, I know who somebody's been there at the early days. And so I emailed Michael. I said, Michael, could you join us and sort of give us for the benefit of everybody, a little bit of a history on what the transfer policy and the rationale and what's important. And for all of us here is we're part of the end user community. Why is this policy relevant to us? Over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Glenn. So I think in starting this journey, we need to basically go back to, if you will, the white paper and the recognition of Icann. So Icann was incorporated, I believe, November of '98. It was recognized shortly thereafter. And one of the first announcements that Icann did was, I believe, in March of '99, where they announced the first 5 testbed registrars. Let me see if I can remember them. Register.com, AOL, register.com, AOL, Melbourne IT, and now I'm sitting there. I'm drawing the blank on the other 2. I will remember them before. It was not was it? I don't believe well, that was AOL. Anyway, what happens is Icann announced the 5 testbed registrars. When they did the announcement, they actually listed all 37. I believe there was 35 or 37 applicants. So Icann basically initially approved all of the initial registrars, but it said it was going to move forward with a testbed stage where they identified those first 5 companies. And one of the things that we began to learn in those early days, and when those first transfers away from network solutions began to happen, was that there was some criminal activity amiss. There were some people that were actually, if you will, submitting transfer requests. Now, what's important here from a historical perspective, and Jim, you'll appreciate this, before the EPP, during this testbed stage, during this initial commercialization or the bifurcation of the registry and the registrar market. The old protocol was the registry registrar protocol. And I was actually, in preparation for this, I was going through some of the old RRP documentation. And one of the things I saw in version 2 was they actually put in basically a NAC request, the ability to deny a transfer request. So initially, when Icann was starting off, this was all about how do we sit there and do we facilitate the movement of domain names, domain name portability, to spur innovation, all this good stuff. But surprise, surprise, the criminal element decided to exploit that. Early on, I would say that was probably in the summer. We met in Reston. I don't know if it was the Marriott or the Sheraton down there in Town Center. And the initial registrars came together, and Jim, you'll appreciate this. That was actually the first time where I met, Hal Lupson and Scott Hemphill face to face at that meeting. And in this meeting, and I give Network Solutions credit, I believe they actually, to the best of my recollection, I believe they paid for the hotel space. It was rather nice of them. But invited to that meeting was a representative from the FBI who said, this is not good. You really need to sit there and to begin to address this problem. So that at the earliest days, even before full competition, there were criminal activities happening, and registrants and businesses were being harmed. Now, that was, as you say, the earliest of days. And what has happened after that was these were some of the internal processes that were put in place. And initially, before we were actually able to address it from from a technical perspective, the lawyers actually got involved in saying, okay, when we identify this, how can we come up with agreements that will allow us to get the domain name back to where it needs to be? So this was an example of the lawyers actually trying to move quicker while the technologists tried to come up with standards. Now, if you move forward, EPP, when the EPP protocol was first rolled out, and that would have been the first two registries that rolled out, and I just saw Jeff, that would have been Affilius and New Star, or New Level. When .info and .biz were launched, these were two registries that first implemented EPP, the EPDP. I'm sorry, I'm mixing the EPP protocol. And Sarah, I know you're smiling there that I'm mixing up my acronyms there. But what was very interesting was that there were mechanisms in place to provide for the auth code. But one of the things that we saw, and Glenn, this goes to a lack of knowledge, not only from a registrant, but also from a technology standpoint. One of the things that we saw at Affilius early on was certain registrars were literally using the same EPP, the EPP auth code for their entire portfolio of all domain names under their sponsorship, thus not providing a high degree of security. And Jim, I think you could talk about this. SAC 007 was one of the first SAC documents that actually identified some early problems and potential best practices. So I guess I'll stop there. I don't want to. I think that's a good stopping point for myself from a historical perspective.
I'm going to give James has been around a long time on this, or Sarah and Daniel. Did you guys want to make a comment on what Michael has said at all? Just before I turn to the next question. Anybody want to
Daniel,
respond?
can I say something?
Yeah, go ahead, Daniel.
That's a great introduction, but I'd like probably if you could also speak about the issue whereby because of the 60-day transfer lock, because also that has been one of the issues that has been of contentious discussion, whether those days were adequate enough. And since now our technology has transformed and the rate at which the lock is enforced could be minimized or increased, because various debates have been going on both within at large and also I think the NCUC about whether these days where the 60-day lock is adequate. Probably it would be good also to give a brief history of the 60-day lock, because that will also help to get our discussion. Yeah.
Sure. So the 60-day lock, interestingly enough, and Jeff Newman and I had some discussions about this. So Jeff, I'm sure you will. I'm trying to follow in the chat while speaking as well. I'm sure Jeff will speak to this. So the original 60-day lock, ironically, was not intended to benefit the end user. That initial 60-day lock was primarily implemented to benefit the registrars. And specifically, it was register.com. So what happened was, going back to my story of bad things happening, the criminals exploiting this new market, not only were they in the process of trying to misappropriate someone else's name, they were also in the process of using stolen credit cards to test out, right? It was a small dollar transaction. Can I register a domain name, test it, and then move on to bigger and more purchases? So one of the problems that happened was the initial framework, and during that time, during the testbed period, domain names actually cost $9, not $6. But what happened was registrars were basically being hit with these chargebacks, because back then they didn't have the APIs to verify. So chargebacks were generally coming a month or two later. So what happened was the registrars, specifically register.com, advocated that they wanted to be able to lock a domain name for the purposes of ensuring that they got paid. Basically, how can we get outside the credit card chargeback window? And then what happened was, if in fact there was a credit card chargeback, in that scenario, the registrar, as was explained by register.com, is, well, if we've not been able to be compensated, we've had to pay, since we've already paid then Network Solutions or paid the registry operator, we have the ability to perhaps recoup that by reselling the domain name. So that is the interest. That is why the 60-day came into play. It was purely originally about registrars being protected about credit card chargebacks. Now, as Jeff and I have discussed, over time, that 60 days has been relied upon for other reasons and has now kind of taken a life on of its own. And I'm not saying whether that's good or bad, but going back to why it was originally done, it was not about registrants, it was all about registrars.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I want to turn to Sarah. Oh, sorry, James, go ahead. James?
Yeah, so I was just going to comment, maybe Sarah can add to this. Well, maybe not, but Michael might know the answer to this too. Since Michael mentioned SAC 7, which was done back in 2006, and that was SAC's first entree into saying all of the things which they've been updated a little bit piecemeal, but this current transfer review policy, one of its interesting things is it's finally taking a holistic view about the transfer review process and really giving the auth info code its due. It was in that 2006 and SAC 7 that we first called out the fact that the auth info code is used to authorize transfers. And in fact, as Michael said, there were all of these problems in the way that they were used. So it had adopted a usage which was inconsistent with the characteristics of its implementation. And the transfer review policy is now addressing this particular fact and getting to this issue. And so with that, I'll leave that. I don't know if anyone knows. The question that I had was, I've never actually clearly identified whether the FOAs came about before or after 2006. I don't know when those appeared. And if anybody knows, that would be a good thing to get track of.
Okay, Sarah.
Jeff Newman says before.
Yeah, and so does Sarah.
Yeah.
So does Sarah. Okay, Sarah, did you want to respond to what James was asking, or can I go on to the next thing?
Well, I had a couple of things to add. Thank you very much, Glenn.
Thank you. Thank you. Go
and
ahead.
but what I had to say wasn't super related to what Jim said, it kind of went back to what Daniel was saying, and just a couple other thoughts that I'll share real quick. So the 60-day lock is an open topic of discussion in the working group right now. And we ran a survey in the registrar stakeholder group. My coworker, Owen Smigelski from Namecheap, put that survey together, asking registrars whether that lock should now be mandatory or optional, and how long it should last for. And what was interesting to me was that the feedback that we got was just all over the place. There didn't seem to be any patterns, just that there was a lot of, people had a lot of different opinions. So I'm still really uncertain what I think about that one, because we're not seeing an issue with chargebacks now. I guess the lock worked, but then does that mean, do we need to keep it? Or if we get rid of the lock, will we see an increase in chargebacks again? I'm really not sure. And the other thing I wanted to mention is just to bring a little bit of focus onto another major change that came with the 2016 changes to the policy, which is that brought in the change of registrant process. So until then, the transfer policy was always relating to domains moving from one registrar to another. And since then, we also have a process to follow when the ownership of a domain name is changing, an ownership transfer. And so that's something that we haven't yet tackled in the working group. That is for a later phase, but it's definitely an important difference in the two, in the original to the updated transfer policy. So it's something else to keep in mind. Thank you.
Great, Sarah. I believe Jeff wants to jump in either to embellish what you were saying or additional information. Welcome, Jeff. Go ahead.
Hey, thanks, Glenn. Yeah, just on some more historical information. So at the time, the first transfer PDP, I was actually a participant in that. And I remember two cows, especially Ross Rader, being, you know, I can't remember if he was the chair or was just so incredibly involved, but we were having an issue at the time that all the registrars were having an issue because Network Solutions at the time was finding reasons to NAC or deny almost every single transfer request. And they were the ones that were hurt the most by the transfer policy because they had 100% of the market. And as Michael said, you know, they introduced 5 new test beds. And so fairly quickly, Network Solutions went from 100% to less than 50%. And so they were trying to keep a stronghold on their customers. And so for a lot of reasons, we had this transfer PDP. Now, when I was participating in it, as Michael said, all the quote new registries at the time were using EPP, the Extensible Provisional Protocol, which called for the creation of auth codes, which was not in the original RRP that was still being used at the time by VeriSign for COM, NET, and I think when it started, it was for .org. I mean, they used it for .org as well, but I think the PDP was overlapping with the .org transition. So some of us that ran EPP registries were pushing for just relying on the auth code without FOIAs, simply because that didn't, in our minds, add any benefit, right? Because the auth code, once the problems that Michael and the SAC worked out, right, that you shouldn't use an auth code for every single registration, they should be unique, it should be a secret. Once that was all worked out, there was no reason to get to have an auth code and a form of authorization. But for a number of reasons, won't go into, mostly political, the community wanted the same process, whether it was a .com on the RRP thin registry, or whether it was biz and info on the EPP, which had auth code. So they wanted one process, and that one process that joined it all was the FOIA. So now that's, you know, an issue now, right? Still of whether FOIA should be requested and whether it really adds value. But that was important to note that initially that was requested by some of the EPP registries, but turned down. And then I think Sarah's got an excellent point, which is that you know, the issue of a registrant transfer wasn't dealt with at all until 2016. But what we saw there were some registrars that were locking domains within or for 60 days after a contact change was made, which made it impossible to change a contact and then transfer the name, right? Because if you change the contact to a new owner, you have to wait 60 days just to transfer it. And if you, so those are some of the issues you're still grappling with, but that's just some more historical context. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And for the benefit of everyone, Jeff, you're just not stopping in here because you have nothing else to do today. But give us a little bit of background on yourself so that the audience can appreciate your contribution to Icann.
Sure. Well, I am a unaffiliated member of the ALAC, so I'm here in that capacity, really. No, I've been in the Icann community for, well, as Michael knows, since pretty much before there was an Icann, and been in a number of different capacities, including, sorry, Jonathan, you're right, the at-large. I am terrible with the use of terms, but I'm still learning. But yeah, so I've been served in a number of capacities. Initially in 1997, 98, I was an IP attorney, and so I was one of the first members of the IPC. Then joined a registry in 2000, joined New Star, did that for 15 years, and then joined a registrar for the next 5 years, and then went out on my own as a consultant now for the past year. So that's my, and many of you know me because I'm heavily involved in the new GTLD process and was the former co-chair with Cheryl Langdon-Orr for the sub-pro PDP that just ended earlier this year. And currently, I guess, the ODP liaison for sub-pro.
Okay, great. Thank you. And if you saw the chat, I'm going to hit you up as a speaker in 2022. So please fill out the form. So now that we got you on this call, we're not going to let you run away. Okay, so I want to turn to James. James, you have a chance. Do you want to talk about the new policy or the new policy changes? Now we have a level set in terms of where we are historically. Do you want to move us forward on where, what can we expect? And what's really important and is how this policy affects the end users. Go ahead.
So let me make 2 points, and I'll speak with maybe I'll put on a slightly different hat for my second point. But from the point of view of registries and our role in this transfer review policy, we view this transfer process in general really as primarily an issue for registrars to deal with and to address. So in that role, we're trying to have a very light hand in what happens and what goes on there, because from our point of view, our job is to facilitate and support the registrars. We already have a role, which is that a gaining registrar, submits what is previously being called an auth info code. We're going to change its name as part of all this and call it a transfer authorization code. So we're going to give it a name that represents its role and call it a TAC. And that's useful. Registrars will be able to work on giving it all the proper set of requirements that it ought to have and give it the attention it ought to have. But the gaining registrar submits a TAC to us, and we just look to see if the TAC that they submitted matches the one that we have. And if it does, then we interact with the registrar of record to make sure that they don't reject the transfer. And as long as they don't reject it, or the NAC, as Michael referred to it, I mean, historically, that's the way the protocol has worked up to this point. They have an opportunity to say no, then we effect the transfer. So the registries will then change the internal master database to be in agreement with that. And then the new registrar can make whatever updates and do what they want with it on behalf of a registrant. So that's one set of things. And we're trying to leave that role, to keep that minimal role in this process. We just want to be supportive of that and let the registrars do what they need to do. It's interesting that the second point that I'll make is along the way, and very supportive of the fact that the registrars are absorbing a desire to want to enhance the security, if you will, the overall emphasis on protecting the registrant as part of this transfer process. And that opens up an opportunity to get into a lot of potential changes that provide benefits to a registrant. I will only speak about the things that affect the registry. I'll leave the rest to Sarah to represent. But I've tried to be a bit of a contributor on the security side to some of the principles that letting the group deal with them. But what affects a registry in this respect is there is an opportunity for registrars to help support there's an opportunity for registries to help support registrars in their management of the TAC. And so, the registrars have been giving some consideration to placing interesting rules like when the registry stores the TAC, when it has one that it now has to worry about on behalf of the gaining registrar, for example, that should be encrypted. I mean, that should be an obvious requirement. And sure. I think that most registries probably already do this. I know that, we do, for example, and I'm sure that many others do, but it's not, it's not a requirement. And it really ought to be, you really ought to provide that particular protection to that particular characteristic. And there are some analog restrictions on or requirements on registrars that are consistent with that, Sarah will talk about when she talks about the registrar role. So there are a number of things that we're getting into. And then the last point that I'll make in this space is that using the TAC as a transfer authorization code and declaring that it functionally has that role provides a basis for re-examining the presence of the FOA and those authorization forms. Now, the temporary specification, of course, made the FOAs not be necessary. So that was sort of, deployed in 2018. But now we're making that an integral part of policy, and we're adding all the rest of the details around that. So giving the auth info now a TAC, a well-defined role, a well-defined name, gives you the opportunity to create all the appropriate characteristics that really do get us to a place where the FOA is not necessary in a digital world. You really want to create a more digital, kind of opportunity for these things to happen. And so that I think is a good thing, and we're on that path. And that's our role as registries, to support registrars in this tremendous pickup that they're doing in going towards this. So I'll turn it back to you and let Sarah speak about those issues.
Yeah, exactly. I want to turn over to Sarah. You were singled out, Sarah, before I turn to Daniel. Can you address that issue that James brought up?
For sure, yeah. And so James was just talking about the gaining registrar FOA. I'm actually going to take a little step back and speak a little bit differently before I get to that. So when we're focusing in this new PDP working group, we're focusing on reviewing every aspect of the transfer process, as has already been said, to make sure that we keep what makes sense, keep what is helpful, and get rid of what's not working. So I really do believe that this can only benefit the end user, right? Because they're going to end up with a process that both helps keep their domain name safe where they want it to be, while it also lets them move that domain name where they want it to go as easily as possible. So everything that Jim just mentioned about the security of the process is really geared towards that end user just ability to own and manage your services where you want them. And that's, of course, really crucial for registrars as well. We want happy customers, right? So I think the most noticeable change that we're going to see coming out of this policy has already happened, and that's no longer using the gaining registrar form of authorization, the FOA email, as Jim just mentioned. Yeah, so I could get into why we can't do that for a variety of reasons if people are interested. I think the real upshot is that it's been, like 2.5 years already? 3? When was 2018? It was a while ago. And we have not seen any problems. There's maybe a couple of problems. We don't have a systemic issue to resolve with that. So getting rid of it is a very safe choice, I think, and just makes more sense for everyone. And then thinking about tax security, so Jim mentioned that it's encrypted, and we're going to see other standards or security requirements for registrars to follow. So there would be a standard for how long it needs to be in terms of how many characters. There could be, I think, a standard for what types of characters to use. I actually can't remember offhand if we're going to formalize that or make a suggestion, right? So there's some things need to be in policy, some things can be implementation notes and still be beneficial. And then the other really interesting thing is that it will have a TTL, a time to live. that once that TTL expires, the code disappears and can't be used anymore. So if a person does request their code and then not do their transfer, they don't have to worry that if they forget about it, leave it in their email, and then it gets hacked a year later, that they're going to lose that domain name, right? So that TTL, I think, will be very beneficial. And then also, the code won't always exist. It will only be created when the registrant requests it, not when the domain is created. And then, so it gets created when it's needed, then it expires. When the transfer is completed, it gets blanked out again entirely. And the registry doesn't even know what the code is, right? Because it's encrypted. So they can confirm that the code provided matches the code that the registrar previously set, but they can't, it can't just be accessed and pulled out of their system. So those are all really helpful security things. And there's one more like kind of new idea that we're thinking about that I don't think exists. I'm sure it does not exist in the policy yet, which is that if somebody attempts to do a domain transfer, provides an invalid TAC for a certain number of attempts that we haven't yet quite settled on, the registry must notify the registrar, who must notify the domain owner. Maybe may notify the domain owner. We're still, it's a process. But so that's a really important security thing, right? Just like how if somebody tries to log into your Gmail account and then they use the wrong password a few times, you'll get a notification, I think. It's a good security feature, yeah. And the other sort of piece of work that we've been looking at is on the losing FOA. What kind of communications does the current losing registrar, the registrar of record, need to send to the domain owner? What's useful and what would be, like what's useful, but then what's not useful anymore, right? How much information do they actually need to provide? So we're thinking about that. Now looking at the chat, okay, so Jeff, what if it is just a typo? Yeah, that is an issue. But you know what? If somebody's entering a typo 3 times, they have a problem and they need some help with that, right? So it's not always malicious, but it is indication that there's an issue of some sort. To David's question about how many domains are transferred, that is I don't know. I would be very curious to have that information, but I don't have it. And then Jeff, to your, yes, there is a threshold. I think it's 3 to 5 attempts. And to your other question about using auth codes for other purposes such as credentialing, I think the answer is no, partly because once it's set in the registry, it gets hashed, but the registrar still has to know what it is. Yeah, so I'm not sure. I'm going to look that up.
Okay, well, there's so much you said in that short amount of time. I'm learning so much about transfer policy. More wanted to know, but no, this is fantastic. Thank you all. Let's move back to Daniel, and I want to make sure. I think James, you're leaving at the top of the hour, right? Okay, I want to make sure we circle back to you. I want to make sure your thoughts are captured, that we don't lose you in the mix, because you're going to be gone in 10 minutes. Okay, Daniel, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Glenn. Absolutely, Sarah has spoken a lot about security. And just one of the things that we looked at in the TPR, the transfer policy, is when it comes to notifications, in case an unauthorized transfer is taking place, how does the registrant or the registrant name holder be notified? So there's a series of notifications that back and forth in every respective process that the domain is going to be transferred. And before even you get into the TAC, there is the issue of the domain lock. Before a domain can be transferred, the domain lock has to be disabled. Then after that, you have to provide the TAC, and then after that, the registry has to check with the other respective registry whether the TAC is able to, whether the equivalent or the match. Then after that, a transfer can take place. But then within all that respective process, the registration name holder can decide to say, no, I would not want to transfer my domain, and then the domain transfer can be halted. So when it comes to the end user experience, the TPR is making sure, the policy working group is making sure that the domains, the domain transfer are successfully transferred in a legitimate way, and also issues of domain hijacking can be solved within the new respective requirement. So the new recommendations are taking care of the end user perspective, but then also the registrar has a big role to play in this. Yeah, back to you, Glenn. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I mentioned in the chat to Marita and Jonathan, because they're the ALAC representatives for NARALO, is there anything either of you want to comment on with regards to ALAC's position regarding this current policy? Go ahead, Jonathan.
Sure, I can. Again, I feel like this is a topic where we're trying to approach this almost intentionally from a position of ignorance, if that makes sense, right? As end users, we're trying to think about just what is the end user experience with this, more so than what the intricacies are behind the scenes. And so to that end, I think that there are some within the at-large community that are that would really like to see a more affirmative action on the part of the losing registrar, so that the losing registrant, even if it might be the same person, but the losing registrant at the losing registrar to actually get confirmation of that. And I realize that the auth code is meant to play that role. And I guess the scenario in which it's a concern is if there's some sort of a breach on the end of that account or something like that. And so it's such a valuable asset to people. I think that there's definitely a feeling that having some kind of a check and balance there that I have to click something to approve it would be useful. And then on the flip side of that, the long lock feels like something onerous for end users, and so we really wonder whether it needs to be that long, because that's just something that feels like an inconvenience on our end if we're not aware of what, again, just speaking from our own experience perspective, not selfishly, right? So those juxtapositions, on the one hand, I'm sorry, this is an ill-formed intervention, but on the one hand, we're saying that, hey, it's not really a problem anymore. We don't have the problems that we had when this first came out of the level of malfeasance associated with this. And so therefore, we don't need to do the confirmations and the FOAs, but we still want to keep this 60-day lock because that benefits us, right? And so there's this weird juxtaposition of those two things that I think is a cause of consternation among the at-large community and certainly among NARALO. I hope that was clear enough to address.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I believe Sarah's going to respond. Sarah, go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, I do have a couple thoughts on that. So this question about the TAC itself is valuable, but if there's an account breach, what happens, right? So this is something that we have been thinking about, especially along the lines of what happens if somebody else accesses my account at the registrar and gets the TAC and then transfers my domain away? How am I going to know what happened? So we're working out a requirement for a separate notification, and we're just trying to figure out how to make it the most efficient and effective. But a notification that would be sent to say somebody has requested the TAC and it was sent to the domain owner. So if it's being sent by email and that notification is by email, then maybe I'm going to get 2 emails. Maybe that's not helpful. But if it's requested in the account control panel, then a separate email could be a very useful notification, right? We're definitely thinking about how to balance security and preventing chargebacks against functionality and the ability of the user to select what their provider is. So something else that is on our plan, but we haven't addressed at all, is a question of a fast undo option. Some kind of emergency, hey, this transfer was wrong, it shouldn't have happened, put my domain back where it came from. So that's a thing that I look forward to working out how we're going to accomplish that, because that's like a really new thing. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Due to time, James will be leaving for a meeting, and it's a miss for me to not congratulate you going on to the Icann board. So good luck in the next 3 years. I'm sure Michael has lots of opinions on his life. Formerly, no, he has no opinion. Okay, James, I want to give you an opportunity because you won't have a chance at the end to sort of reflect on what you've heard so far and maybe some things that have been missing in a conversation that should have been mentioned, and then we'll launch back into it after you leave. So, James, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Glenn, and thank you for the acknowledgement and congratulations. I want to first applaud this discussion that's going on here. I think that all the right questions are being asked about sort of issues surrounding this change and this opportunity for change. And as you're hearing, Sarah's been responding to most of the questions, but these are all things that have come up in the transfer policy too. I mean, in general, the commitment really is to protecting registrants. And I, speaking from a registry point of view, I want to commend registrars for really focusing on that part of the conversation in the discussions and in the transfer review PDP. There's a significant emphasis on how do we make it better for registrants and still keep all the protections that were put in place when the transfer review policy, I mean, as it's evolved over the years, it obviously has gotten some good principles in place. Can we make those principles implement better? And then while we're doing this review, can we add more that's even better for a registrant? So from an at-large community point of view, you're asking all the right questions, and all those discussions, I haven't heard any question that hasn't already been opened and discussed in the group. I'll add one other little bit that, again, registries are here, and part of our role in this process is supporting registrars in their goal of wanting to better protect registrants. I mean, we all want a better system overall. I mean, it's to all of our benefits to have something like that, obviously. And one of the interesting things is when Sarah was mentioning that, a registry would have to do some new work. And one of those new things is keeping track of how many attempts there are to use attack, and then notifying the registrar of record of that stuff going on. Well, that's a new thing that has not been done before, and that's never been present before. But if we're gonna move towards better managing these kinds of things, you want that process to exist, which means a registry is going to have to proactively. We need a mechanism for reaching out to registrars to do the right thing. And then, as Sarah said, registrars, need a rule or a guideline. That's still a discussion as to what they do given that information with respect to the registrant. Another critical piece of this is, how do you offer a final notification to a registrant that the transfer was successful? That really doesn't exist in today's system. So there's no way for a registrar of record really to notify a registrant that something happened. All you really have today are timeouts. But one of the things that we're talking about is registry supporting the registrar of record, right? And again, as an additional enhancement to protect registrants, the registry will tell the registrar of record where the name went. That turns out to be another thing that the registrar of record doesn't know today. You really have no way of being aware of where a name went to. So if you want this immediate callback kind of process, well, you need some information to make all of that happen and to manage all of that. So that becomes, again, another piece that registries need to provide to registrars. You need to be able to tell the registrar of record where the name went, so they could use that information in an appropriate way, in principle, as part of notifying a registrant, gee, it was completed, it actually happened. By the way, this is where it went. Let's make sure that the right thing happened. Again, if attack is lost along the way, getting from a registrant to a gaining registry, a gaining registrar, all of these things are protected and enhanced by doing those kinds of things. So I just want to acknowledge the good work that's going on in the review PDP with the registrars. Congratulate at large and asking all the right questions, and I think that's important, and we welcome all of that. So Daniel's been a good participant in all of that, and hopefully that interaction will continue, and we'll capture any questions that come up here that haven't been thought about. So thank you for the opportunity to be here. I apologize again for having to move on. I have a commitment here that I just can't get out of. So I'll pause for one more minute and listen to see if anything else comes up, but otherwise I'll just say my goodbyes now. Thanks,
Perfect.
Glenn, for the opportunity for
No,
last
no,
words.
no, thank you so much. And I appreciate your time. And I think this is a really intelligent discussion. And it's so much more refreshing than having all kinds of slides where it, death by PowerPoint. But I think we're drilling down into the nuts and bolts. And I could see Michael's face, his brain was ticking when you were talking, and I know he's dying to say something. You can see the smile. I know he's going to say something. So go ahead, Michael. You're going to react on what something James said.
No, I'm actually just. Jim and I generally, I would say, tend to be aligned a lot philosophically, independent of our many years of working together. As I said in the chat, I am just actually thinking of some of the discussions that Milton raised in the IGF panel about digital self-determination and digital sovereignty, and how, going back to, at large here, how do we really empower the user to have a voice and say in these important assets. So that's kind of where my brain was going, and some of the other stuff that was going on. So don't want to delay Jim from getting to his other meeting.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, James. And thanks for joining us. You brought up Milton Mueller. I did attend that session with him, and I think it's a wider discussion that he's having even within the at-large community. Him and Parinder, they're basically looking at the IGF leadership model, questioning the process that they actually select the people. So are you implying that maybe some of the concepts that Milton is looking at, that maybe some of the root innovations that Milton is saying that maybe should be brought into this policy group? Or I'm not sure what exactly what you're getting at.
So I think one of the things that I was particularly interested is in the issue of digital sovereignty versus digital self-determination. And I think sometimes sovereignty is used or convoluted in an individual capacity, which I think just messes things up. So I think Milton did a pretty good job of trying to firewall that. And I think it is important from a digital sovereignty perspective. There are certain rules that are going to be applied. So we, within a multi-stakeholder model here, could say, this is what we think the policy should be. But it is quite possible that a national government could impose certain laws that they think is important to protect. In the U.S., there are OFAC requirements. In Europe, you have the DSA and NIS that are working their way through. In China, you have real name verification. So I think it's important that the Icann multi-stakeholder model be very cognizant of how our policy development processes and practices need to work in a world that is very dynamically evolving. And that, to me, was what I really found interesting on some of Milton's contributions, that distinction between digital sovereignty, which nation states have historically had and recognized since the 16th century, well formed, and this concept of digital self-determination and how we can protect individual users to the maximum extent possible within those national laws upon which they're bound. So these are just some of the thoughts that were kind of running through my mind when I was hearing all the other speakers thinking, and how I was trying to correlate that to everything I heard from last week's IGF sessions. So
Great.
Hopefully that makes sense.
Great, thank you. And I'll when I have a chance, I'll send to the list the links to Milton's session that was at the IGF. So well worth listening to. Excellent points. So let me turn back to the issue that we brought up a little earlier about the end user community, and our representative Daniel Steiner is not on the call, but Michael, Daniel, can you clarify some of the things that the at-large community is actually having an input into shaping this policy? Is there something that we've had? If we were not there, Daniel, would certain things be missing that we are contributing? I guess I want the at-large community here to realize what role we're playing in this policy process.
Thank you very much, Glenn. One of the issues that we have been putting forward as at large is how does the 60-day lock affect the end user? That's one of the issues that we've been able to discuss. And also another issue is the security of the domain when it comes to the end user. Once the end user owns the domain, how are they going to make sure that their domain is protected? How can we make sure that an unauthorized transfer is not taking place, or maybe a domain hijacking is not taking place? And what is the role of the resellers in the transfer process? Because most of the end users, they do not buy their domains directly from the registry. They end up using third-party resellers, and then the third party, does it bring in does it contribute to a data breach or the security situation when it comes to the domain industry? So all these factors here all affect the end user when it comes to the domain ownership. And so one of the last discussions that came up was that when it comes to the registrar name holder, in case they need to make a transfer, then the registry must be able to provide the tag directly to the registrar name holder without necessarily getting through the reseller. So the reseller at this point is not aware of the tag in the process of the domain transfer. So those are some of the issues that affect the end users. Thank you. I welcome any questions regarding to that.
Okay, great. Thank you, Daniel. I want to turn to the audience. We have 19 participants in the room, and I want to give an opportunity for those who have been quiet to jump in and ask the panel any questions. Is there any, and I believe Sarah's going to clarify something in 1 second. I just want to give people to formulate their thoughts and pose questions. Sarah, did you want to react? And I believe Eduardo will jump in right after you. Is there something you wanted to clarify there?
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. This is Sarah. Just the membership numbers that you shared in the chat maybe was a copy pasting error. There are not 31 registrars working on this project. I can't imagine what policy would get 31 different registrars all working on it together. My goodness, that would be great. There are 10. There are 10 registrar representatives, up to 10. We don't usually get all 10 at the same meeting. Thank you.
This is the source that I took it from. It was from the Icann site. So thank you for clarifying that. So that makes a big difference in perspective, because if it was 31, the at-large community would have a very small voice for sure. Let me turn over to Eduardo. Go ahead, Ed. Who wants to tackle that? Okay, Sarah, go ahead.
Thank you. I have a couple of thoughts on this. So, of course, the first thing I think is, if your mother doesn't own a domain name, then I really can't think how this would affect her, right? But no, that is wrong, because she uses the internet. And so it's very important that the people who use the website, even if they don't own it, can rely that it is where it's supposed to be, that the website owner, the domain owner, is actually able to manage their domain name in an appropriate manner, right? This is one of the cornerstones of how the internet works, is that domain owners have that control over their domain name. And so as a user of websites, you want to make sure that the system through which websites exist is working properly. So although it may not affect your mother directly in her use of the internet, I think overall, it's really important that we maintain this system. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, that I think Jonathan has a comment on that. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, Sarah pretty much said what I was going to say. I think that just to get more specific and less general in the answer, I think the implication for typical end user is that the domain name might now point to a bad site, right? So it's sort of like an advanced form of phishing. Instead of coming up with a site name that's got a typo in it or something like that, which is the normal use, I would have the actual site, and the domain would come to my phishing site instead of the site that it was meant to go to. So I think that's probably the largest impact on a typical end user of this transfer policy, and why the at-large is sort of doubly concerned about it is that the implication of this is about the mistransfer, if you will, of domains. So that matters to end user registrants, but it also matters to end users generally. If suddenly an e-commerce site or something like that, somebody's Etsy site or something now points to the wrong place. So that would be the implication.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, I'm just looking for the next person to jump in and add a question or comment. Maureen, if you have something to say, please jump in. If not, I am okay. Look, Nalia, do you have anything from an Icann point of view? Any comments or questions for the panel? And I think that's a Jonathan, is that an old hand or a new one? Oh, I think the hand is, go ahead. Yes, please.
Hi, Glenn, sorry, I saw you called on me. I was away. I don't have any specific questions for the panel. I think this was a very enlightening discussion. I commend you guys for having really great informative calls every month. I found this really fascinating. So thank you so much. No questions. Just keep up the great sessions.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the vote of confidence. I have to force Eduardo every month to have sessions like this. He wants to talk about bingo, or he wants to talk about the baseball. He wants to talk about the NFL game last night. But I said, no, we got to do our job. But it's tough, right, Eduardo? So I think, Eduardo, I don't see anything else. We're going to be able to wrap up a little sooner than expected. But I wanted to turn back to the panel and let them, just like what we gave Dr. Galvin a chance to do some final comments. So maybe if Sarah, you wanted to, I'll give it to you, then to Michael, then to Daniel, to do some final comments.
Super. Thank you so much for having me. This has been really delightful. It's funny, I really enjoy this PDP. It's just a lot of fun. And working on the transfer policy has been a goal of mine for longer than I've worked at TUCAS, so several years. And I'm just really happy to finally be able to do it. I really appreciate the focus that everybody has in this call. As I mentioned in the chat, I'm pointing to the chat, as I mentioned, about the balance between security and ease of use or functionality, or the user's ability to put their domain where they want it, right? We have to figure out how to balance that, but that's not a new issue. It's not a new question. That is the fundamental question of the internet. Thank you and have a good day.
Great, thank you. Let me turn to Michael. Any final comments?
No, I appreciate being able to share some historical perspectives. I think this, as Sarah says, is an important topic that impacts the entire ecosystem. I think we need to get this right so that this process works to the benefit of the end user registrants, as well as registries, registrars, and resellers within the entire ecosystem.
Great, thank you so much. And over to Daniel.
Yeah, thank you very much, Glenn. And I'm very happy to be part of this NARALO call to present about the TPR. And one thing that I have experienced in the TPR is that we are touching every corner of the domain transfer, right from the end user to the registry. And we're looking critically at the issues of security in the transfer. And I'm very sure that the recommendations that we are making from the TPR are going to be impactful and create change in the way the domain are being transferred. And also the deliberations are quite really interesting. and encouraging. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Daniel. And I appreciate you taking the time today to join us. I know you have an important surgery tomorrow, so thank you. I hope this was a great diversion for you. So thank you again for so much for joining us today. So I'm going to turn it back, and I first of all, I'd like to thank everybody, including Jeff, who came in and gave some really good comments and chats, and hopefully he realizes we're going to be asking him to come in as a speaker in 22. But I'm going to turn it back over to Eduardo, and thank you very much. Over to you, Eduardo. Great, thanks, everybody. Don't forget to fill out the survey, and also any suggestions for future topics. So again, thanks, everybody. And hey, Marita, there you are. Great, and thanks all. Hey, Marita, we have you on the queue in January, so we're going to we got you nailed.
Recording stopped.
Thanks for the advance notice.
We will let you know. We will let you know. Hey, for those Bill's on the call, don't forget.